I'd like to welcome everybody back to NBCC Code of Ethics 2023. Now, yes, I know it's 2024, but they put out this Code of Ethics in 2023. This is part 2 of 8, and I am Dr. Dawn-Elise Snipes, your host. We are going to review the 2023 NBCC Code of Ethics point by point, specifically today focusing on personal values, unavoidable harm, confidentiality, bartering, multiple relationships, and harassment. Now, we have to go over confidentiality and multiple relationships because when you look at ethical violations, those are the two most common areas where people run into trouble. And so we're going to go into detail about that. Again, I am going to be asking you questions. Hopefully they're not rhetorical, and to get your input about some of these things that we talk about today. In part 1, we discussed the 7 ethical principles and the ABCDEs for ethical decision making. We also reviewed NBCC core values and professional responsibilities. So let's move on. Today we're going to talk about more things that we as clinicians need to do, and we need to make sure our agencies are doing. Counselors shall take proactive measures to avoid harming their clients and avoid imposing personal values on those who receive their professional services. How might we or our organizations do this directly or indirectly? Now, by directly, I mean we actually tell them, you should think this way, or you should feel this way. Hear the shoulds in there and the boundary violations all over the place. Obviously, we don't want to do that. And hopefully, we don't directly come out and impose our values. But indirectly, we may impose our values. And so again, I'll ask, how do you think you might see this happening? For example, when somebody walks into your lobby, what do they see? What do they hear? Do they hear gospel music over the loudspeaker? Do they hear heavy metal? What do they hear? Do they hear silence? What do they see in terms of your decor? Are you communicating to them that you have a welcoming, safe environment for everybody, or only for people who fit a certain description? And that's indirectly imposing our values. Another way we can indirectly impose our values is in our assessment. When we're going through and we're asking, are you married? Or what is your spouse's name? For people who are in partnerships that don't want to get married, that feels like a judgment. For people who are in polyamorous relationships, that definitely feels like a judgment. If we ask somebody about their partner or their spouse and we assume that it is a monogamous heterosexual relationship, then again, we are, I call it indirectly, imposing our values. We're not coming out and saying it, but we're not being respectful of the fact that other people may have different values. How do we elicit our clients' personal values? If we're going to try to avoid imposing ours, that's great. But it's also important to understand what our clients' values are. What is important to you? What helps you feel safe? What helps you have your rich and meaningful life? And the best way we can do this is by talking to them. And not necessarily just the assessment or in the clinical session. Notice how they're dressed. Notice, if they come in and they've got a t-shirt on for, 5-finger death punch, well, then they probably like heavy metal. And you may talk to them about that. If they, you can talk about things that you observe. You can show interest in your clients to learn about their values. In terms of a values activity, some things that we may impose on people. Independence versus interdependence. And this is a big one. When in addiction counseling, for example, sometimes we're talking about setting boundaries and having to step away or back up from a relationship. And in some families, cutting off somebody, separating from your parents because they're dysfunctional and they're contributing to your condition, that's not okay. It's the family is the core unit, not the individual. In the United States, a lot of us have been raised where the individual is the core unit and the family's there, great. But if they're not, we'll find other family. That's not true with all cultures. So we need to be respectful of that. Even if the core family has issues, and all families have issues, we need to help the person figure out how to navigate those issues in the best possible way to help them move toward their recovery. In terms of spirituality, and this can be a big one. Some people are very spiritual but not religious. Some people may have a different religion. And thinking about how you talk about spirituality and what you communicate about spirituality. And I'm a firm believer, now this is my opinion, I'm a firm believer in authenticity, not having, all my decor in my office being in your face, this is who I am. But I am not going to avoid putting things in my office that are meaningful to me. However, I will also tend to complement those with things that I know may be comforting and meaningful to my clients. Sexuality is another issue, and it's not just your sexual orientation. It also has to do with sexual practices, and we talked about this a few weeks ago with kink and BDSM. Some people engage in those behaviors, and they find them empowering. They enjoy those behaviors. They're not causing them mental distress in any sort of way. But we can cause mental distress if we are not aware of kink and BDSM practices, if we pathologize something that even the American Psychological Association has depathologized. We need to be very sensitive in how we approach sexuality and relationships, which takes us to relationship structures. There are a lot of people who believe in a monogamous relationship, but there are also a lot of people who don't. There are a lot of people who have different relationship structures that work for them. There are also blended families, and depending on your views and your values about divorce, for example, you may inadvertently impose your values. So I encourage you to think about each of these things and look around your office and evaluate your paperwork and think about interactions you've had to assess, am I imposing my values? Am I communicating to clients in ways that might make them feel, well, this is not safe to talk about? Parenting. Oh, that's a big one. A lot of people have very different parenting styles. And while I might not agree with necessarily the way my client is parenting their child, it's not for me to impose my values unless, obviously, the child is in danger, if you will. Medication use is another value. Some therapists are very pro-medication use, and some clients are not. Some clients are very pro-medication use, and some therapists are not. This is especially a poignant issue when we start talking about medication-assisted therapy and opioid use disorders. Educate yourself about medication use. Be understanding or willing to accept if your client is on medication-assisted therapy. It's something that needs to be talked about. And some people will be on it forever. The DEA guidelines are really, you're supposed to be on it for like 18 months and then taper off. It's supposed to be a transition thing. But for a lot of people, it's not. However, harm reduction, we need to examine our beliefs about that. And again, recognize that the client has autonomy, back to last week, has autonomy to choose the interventions that they feel will be most beneficial to them. Some people don't think that counseling with a therapist is okay. They think they can talk to their pastor or their priest or their, spiritual leader, and that may be okay. But it's not okay to talk to some random stranger at an agency, which a lot of us are in that position of being some random stranger in an agency. Being sensitive to that. I know my grandmother was raised in the time when you kept your dirty laundry, if you will, that's what she called it, behind closed doors. You didn't go out and tell people about it. Therapy was not something they did back in the 40s and 50s. Thankfully, a lot of Americans have started to embrace therapy, but recognizing, hey, not everybody's comfortable with this. And you're like, well, why are they in my office if they don't believe in counseling with a therapist? They may be involuntary. Somebody may have said, if you're going to stay in a relationship with me, if you're going to avoid jail, if you're going to keep your kids, if you're going to fill in the blank, you have to go to therapy. So we need to be sensitive to people's values. What other values might we impose on people? While y'all are thinking about that, we're going to move on to unavoidable harm. Now, sometimes there is unanticipated and unavoidable harm. And when that harm happens, we need to seek to address it. So what is unavoidable harm? You're thinking, I've done this whole non-malfeasance thing. I've evaluated my practice. Of course, I'm not going to do harm to my clients. Well, you might. And that's where it's unanticipated or unavoidable. Sometimes it happens. So thinking about what is unavoidable harm, how is it harmful, and how can you address it? Mandatory reporting. It's there for a reason. It is there to keep people safe, if you will. If you know of child abuse, elder abuse, or if somebody is acutely suicidal or homicidal with a intended victim, if there's imminent harm, we need to take steps to address that issue. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, always, that can feel really uncomfortable if we're having to do something that our client doesn't want us to do. Obviously, if they're feeling suicidal and they're like, hey, I really need to go to the crisis stabilization unit, great, I'll make that transfer. But if they are not wanting to, then that clinical decision comes up. So what harm does this cause? Well, let's think about it. If somebody is taking away your freedom, or if somebody is telling on you, if you will, that can remind them of prior traumas when they have been powerless, when people have gone behind their back. How can we address this? Ideally, you're authentic and you're upfront with your clients when it's safe to do so about, hey, I believe that you need to go to CSU and be evaluated by a psychiatrist. I believe that there is a requirement, based on what you've told me, that we report what's going on because there may be some child abuse, if the person maybe is in a domestically violent relationship. Letting them know ahead of time, again, when it's safe to do so for both the client that you're working with as well as unintended victims or the children or whatever. Having them make the report in your presence and documenting all of that, or you making the report with them in your presence so they don't feel as anxious about, well, what did you say? Or, you did this behind my back. We want to do as much as we can to help clients recognize what's going on, why it's happening, and help them navigate the process. That's not always possible. And when it's not possible, when you have to do something without your client's knowledge for the safety of the child, for example, that probably means that your relationship with that client is going to be permanently damaged. It's possible to work through it, but the occasion is pretty rare that a client is ready to resume treatment with you after you have made an abuse report regarding them. Okay, so we do need to recognize they're coming to you, they're sharing with you, they're being vulnerable with you, and then you say, all right, stop. Now we got to get this other group involved, and there's going to be an investigation or something. And that can feel very traumatizing, and the person can feel very powerless. You mean I could lose my kids? You mean I am locked up for 72 hours? So we do need to consider that. Relationship changes. When we are doing work with people and they are processing things, and I saw this a lot in residential treatment, when people they'd be working hard 30 days, 45 days, but their family wouldn't be doing anything when in terms of changing or being part of the process. So when they discharged, they had changed, but their relationships had stayed the same, which often caused conflict and sometimes ended up causing actual relationship changes where the person in recovery said, you know what? I can't be in a relationship with you if you're going to continue using, or I can't do this right now. And that is ultimately, we hope, in the best interest of the client that they're making that decision, but it's still devastating. Whenever we have to end a relationship, it can be devastating. And the other person may experience, grief over the loss. If there are children involved, that could be that unanticipated or unavoidable harm. Creating a dependence on therapy is another issue that we need to be very cognizant of. We don't want our clients believing that they need us. And I know that sounds weird. We're there to help them. We are an instrument to help them move toward their rich and meaningful life. We are a catalyst for change, but we don't want them to think that every time the weather changes, they need to come in and get our opinion. We need to help them develop the skills and tools to move toward their rich and meaningful life and develop that support network that doesn't include us eventually. Emotional discomfort or symptom exacerbation. This is pretty common, especially if you're doing any sort of trauma work where you're having to look at some of those things the person hasn't wanted to look at for a while. How can we address these things? And relationship changes, dependence on therapy, emotional discomfort. Part of that comes with talking with the client consistently about what skills they have, what they're empowered to do, what they want to do, engaging them in the process. When you start talking about trauma, making sure that they have the skills of distress tolerance and downregulation before you start opening that Pandora's box, and empowering them to set the pace of how quickly you're going through the process, making sure that they have a safety plan. If they're going through some intense stuff in therapy, making sure that they have a plan for the rest of their life that will help support them through the process. Having unrealistic expectations by the client or the therapist. Some clients will, here's a perfect example. I had one client who went through a rapid detox program, and they told him that he did this rapid detox for 72 hours and he would be completely detoxed and he'd be fine. Well, he heard, I go through this, I'm not going to have post-acute withdrawal, my body's going to be healed, and I'm going to be hunky-dory. And that's not the way it is. 72 hours gets the drugs out of your system. It doesn't give the nervous system time to repair itself. It doesn't give the hormones chances to rebalance. It doesn't help the person identify cognitive distortions. It doesn't help the person deal with the things that they did in their active addiction that they may feel regret about. So waking up from that, it was sort of a rude awakening because, yes, he was clean, but he was still experiencing post-acute withdrawal. So we want to make sure that clients have reasonable expectations for what we can provide them in treatment. I can't fix you. You have to do the work. I can give you the tools. I can teach you how to use them, but you have to do the work. Something that has been going on for 20 years, we're probably not going to fix in 2 hours. Helping people really wrap their head around what to expect and on what timeline. Likewise, therapists can have unrealistic expectations that make the client feel like, hey, I failed. If the therapist thinks, okay, you should be fine in 10 weeks. And at the end of 10 weeks, the client's going, yeah, I'm still really not feeling great. That's an important thing to understand. And the therapist may also feel like the client hasn't made enough progress, which often, instead of the therapist saying, could I have done something to improve this client's treatment, it often comes down to what did the client fail to do that kept them from moving forward. So we end up inadvertently, hopefully, blaming the client for their lack of progress. And that's not okay either. We need to step back and look and say, what did I miss? Why did this person not progress as quickly as I thought they could? If you have somebody who is chronically relapsing, instead of having this expectation that you go through treatment and you're never going to relapse, that's unrealistic. Looking at relapses as learning opportunities and recognizing that if somebody relapses, it's not my fault as a therapist. It's not the client's fault as, a human being. We missed something. So we need to look at this and we need to set more realistic expectations for this person. And finally, misdiagnosis, particularly if there are multiple conditions. Sometimes people will come into my office and they've got a laundry list of diagnoses, and a lot of them overlap, and some of them totally overlap. So, and the DSM very clearly says to give the diagnosis if it's not better explained by another diagnosis. So if you have two diagnoses that thoroughly explain a person's symptoms, we need to figure out which one it is. So differential diagnosis is important. Now, why are too many diagnoses problematic? Well, if you have this mountain of diagnoses, how do you feel? I mean, if I have one thing to tackle, or even two, I'm like, okay, I can do this. If I've got 15, I may feel helpless. I may feel overwhelmed at even the prospect of moving forward. So we want to make sure that we are not overdiagnosing people. Likewise, we want to make sure that we're not misdiagnosing. For example, if something, in my opinion, we really need to examine people's behavior to identify if they are responses to trauma. If they're responses to trauma, we need to look to a trauma-based diagnosis like PTSD or CPTSD instead of something that's more pathologizing like the personality disorders. And well, that's a different class. That's 3 Saturdays from now. But we do want to recognize that the importance of making an accurate diagnosis to provide an accurate treatment. One of the ways we can do this is by communicating with clients. I sit down with them with the DSM. I do a lot of things with my clients because I don't want them to think what I'm doing is somehow magic. We sit down with the DSM and we talk about each symptom. And after the assessment, I do my write-up of their integrative summary. And then in the next session that we meet, we go over it to see if they agree or they disagree. And my goal or my hope is to really involve them in the process so they feel empowered to address these issues when they come up again. Counselors shall respect each client's privacy and shall solicit only information that contributes to the identified counseling goals or facilitates the counseling process and is also consistent with counseling protocols. First, golden rule in any of the programs that I've ever supervised and in my own practice, explain the whys. If I'm asking you something, if I want some information, I'm going to tell you why I want it. It's not just because I need to fill in a blank. I am asking you to do this because this is why I'm asking you to do it or asking you to tell me about it. It's important that we also respect clients' rights to say no. Standardized intakes can sometimes be very intrusive. And at the beginning of the intake, it can be very helpful to avoid making them feel uncomfortable, to avoid unintentional harm, letting them know, hey, you have the right to tell me I don't want to answer that. You don't have to answer any of the questions you don't want to. And that is a strategy that can be very empowering for the clients because a lot of times they've been told they have to do this, they have to do that. They've just met you. They don't know you from Adam's house cat. They may not want to tell you everything. So we do want to be sensitive to what we require in our intakes, to what kind of information we require people tell us. And we want to make sure that we don't elicit unnecessary details. If Joe is upset because something happened, somebody died, okay? We're going to meet him where he is. We're going to talk about, okay, you're upset. Let's talk about this. I don't need to get down into all the details. Well, who was this? How close were you? Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to let Joe tell me about that person that passed and empower him to sort of take the lead. It doesn't matter to me in the big scheme of things in treatment. It doesn't matter what relationship this person was to Joe. If Joe's devastated about the death, then we're going to deal with the grief. Counselors shall not share client information without specific written consent by the client or legal guardian, except when necessary to prevent serious and foreseeable harm to the client or others, or when otherwise mandated by law or regulation. we have some mandatory reporting things. If you are involved in HIV prevention, you may have some mandatory reporting for communicable disorders. But we need to know what we're required to tell and what we're not. We need to be familiar, and I have multiple classes on HIPAA regulations. We need to be familiar with that. That's our Healthcare Information Privacy and Accessibility Act. We need to be familiar with all of the rules, and there's a lot of them. There are things that you'd be surprised, like zip code, that can be considered protected health information. You also, if you work with people who are substance abusing, you need to be familiar with CFR 42 Part 2. This is the federal regulation that goes the extra step to prevent people from being penalized for seeking treatment for substance abuse issues. It goes the extra step to put a barrier. You're supposed to actually keep the substance abuse progress notes in a different section of the file and they have to be requisitioned or subpoenaed in a different way than other things. Just like when your records are subpoenaed, that doesn't include the mental health progress notes by default. They specifically have to ask for those. We need to keep clients informed at the beginning about mandatory reporting, and if necessary, bring it up again during the treatment process if we feel that they need to have a refresher. The other issue that comes up in confidentiality is how can you ethically share information for consultation or supervision? One of the most common ethical guards, if you will, is if in doubt, seek supervision. Okay, well, but I don't have a signed release of information from my client to talk with you about this. And that can be sort of circumvented as long as you don't provide any identifying information. You talk about them as client X. And if you're in a really small town, this becomes very difficult, and it's probably better to get a release of information for consultation or supervision at the outset, which you can do even in a big city. But eliminating any identifying information is important. Also recognizing that you're talking to another person that is bound by HIPAA regulations. Sorry, have a tickle in my throat. Now, this was a change. It used to be prohibited to do bartering with clients. And this is one of the changes that they made. And it says counselors may accept goods, services, or other non-monetary compensation from clients only in cases where no referrals are possible or appropriate. Now, that has, I would say, if you're going to engage in bartering, I would consult with at least one other professional to see if you're not thinking of a particular referral. If the referral is not possible, we need to ask why, because a lot of people can access telemental health now. So even if you don't have a referral right in your little small town, there may be one in the next town over, and that the person could access virtually. If the referrals are not appropriate for some reason, then okay, then you can continue seeing the person. And I have a question mark there because I really racked my brain to try to think of situations where a referral wouldn't be possible or appropriate. And I was struggling to come up with some because, telehealth has opened so many options for us. It could be that there isn't somebody who specializes in that client's particular issue that is on their insurance panel. It's the best I could come up with. And in that case, all right. The arrangement is discussed with the client in advance. Obviously, if you're going to engage in a bartering relationship, you're going to have some sort of negotiation. The exchange is of a reasonable equivalent value. And this is one that gets sticky for a lot of clinicians because there are a lot of clinicians that will take, a dozen eggs for treatment. If they're inclined to engage in bartering, they're likely also inclined to not have the reasonable equivalent value. There are some who also overestimate the value of their services, and so we need to make sure that it's reasonable and equivalent. How can you do this? You can go online, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute, but you can see what that service or that item or whatever would cost in fair market value. The exchange does not place the counselor in an unfair advantage. If the exchange requires an evaluation of the person's work, they're doing work for you, like they're doing lawn care or painting your house or something, then you're in the position of evaluating, did they do enough? Did they do it well? And that can get really sticky. If you are engaging in bartering, in an ideal situation, there would be someone else that the person would be reporting to, if it's a service, for example. The arrangement is not harmful to the client or their treatment and is documented in the counseling services agreement. You got to document. You got to write it down. Both of you sign it, and it needs to be revisited periodically. So how do we ensure equivalency and maintain fairness? One of the most common bartering things is food. If you're working with someone who is in a rural area, they may provide you food, goods, instead of cash money. So I went online and I found in community-supported agriculture, the large weekly serving is $42. 2 dozen brown eggs, $12, and 1 gallon of goat or cow's milk, $8. So that added up to 44, that added up to close to a reasonable rate for counseling. So you do need to look at that. Arts or crafts. If the person is an artist and they paint this beautiful painting, you want to make sure that they're getting fair market value. If they're crocheting blankets for you, same sort of thing. Go on Etsy. Go look at things that are done by hand. Going on Amazon is not the equivalent because that's something that's mass produced by machines. If they're doing something by hand, you need to compare it to something equivalent. If they tailor your clothes for you, maybe you need somebody who knows how to sew. Office cleaning, house painting, lawn care. All of those are things that I've heard of as far as bartering is concerned, and they can get very tricky. It's very important that the contract is explicit what you expect and how it's going to be evaluated or assessed. If, for example, you're getting food from the client's farm and they bring you a box of produce and you're like, ooh, I don't like radishes, I don't like asparagus, no, take that away. That's not the deal. In a CSA, you get what you get. And it's important that you're aware and you're both on the same page. Now for house cleaning, I have a question mark after that. For me, my opinion, that feels too familiar. Not that I wouldn't trust my clients in my house, but that feels too familiar, having them in my home, cleaning my house and, my toilets and, seeing all my stuff, whatever my stuff is. Because that's in my home, I'm authentic. And that's very personal to me. And that may feel too much like a dual relationship in some ways. Now, you may not feel that way, but just being aware. Despite best efforts, how might nonverbals contribute to harm? Give you the example of lawn care. If you have an agreement that you're going to provide an hour of counseling for the client mowing your lawn every week, and you go out and they mowed your lawn and you're like, what is this? They did a crappy job. And your face shows that, then the client may feel rejected. They may feel like you are disapproving of them. If they give you a painting and it's not exactly what you wanted, but it's what you had asked for, and your face expresses that, that can be devastating because art is very personal to the artist. If the client's part does become substandard, how do you ethically terminate services? How do you say, we had this agreement, but you're not holding up your end of the bargain, so I need to refer you out? How do you avoid the client feeling like they're being abandoned? There's a lot of issues that you need to consider before bartering. Ideally, in the bartering contract, have something in there about termination of services for any reason and how you're going to make referrals. Multiple relationships. Counselors shall strive to avoid multiple relationships. This is more than dual, but multiple. And be mindful of engaging in counseling relationships with those individuals with whom another relationship, such as a community connection, a friendship, or a work relationship, exists. So when they talk about multiple relationships, they're talking about you're seeing them as a client, then they also may be your neighbor, and you may be on the homeowners association with them. Now you're in multiple relationships with them. What are multiple relationships? This is not an exhaustive list, but again, if you live in the same neighborhood and you're on the same homeowners association board or going to the same homeowners association meetings, if you're part of the same PTA group or any other board or group membership, even a church, it could be defined as a multiple relationship. Now, if you're in a church that has 80 congregants and you both happen to go to that church, acknowledging that you might see each other is one thing. If you are in the same Bible study together, that's when we start getting into a multiple relationship, because you're not just seeing each other in passing, but you're actually engaging with that other person. Being a pastor or spiritual leader for the person. And I know it's done, but according to NBCC and ACA, if you are seeing somebody in a spiritual setting, and then you're also seeing them over here as a counselor, not as part of your pastoral duties, but as part of your counseling practice, it can be considered a dual relationship, and it can get kind of muddy when you're doing both of those things, especially when it starts concerning other people. Social media or in real life friends, no. If they're your client, they're your client. They're not your friends on social media or in real life. Don't date your clients. I mean, I shouldn't even have to say that. I shouldn't, but I do. Seeing a coworker, a friend, or a neighbor's spouse, child, or parent in therapy. One rule that a former supervisor of mine always used to reference, he called it 3 degrees of separation. And so if you know this person, you don't want to see their spouse or child. If you are seeing their grandchild, for example, that's the 3rd degree of separation. And possibly it might be okay. If you're seeing a friend of a friend of a friend, okay. But it gets very sticky when you're seeing somebody that is close to somebody that you're close to, because they can misperceive things as violations of confidentiality. So that's a whole different thing we could go into. But according to both ACA and NBCC, we need to be very cognizant of multiple relationships, and those aren't just romantic relationships. You don't want to see a client who's distantly related to you. You don't want to be seeing your third cousin in therapy. They may show up at the family reunion, and that's, going to be a problem. And business relationships. You don't want to open a business with a client. And you want to be very careful when patronizing a client's business or practice, especially if it's a service business provided by them. For example, you're seeing them as your doctor, your vet, your plumber, your auto mechanic. Now, if the person runs a small antique shop, that might be less problematic, but you still need to be conscious of how might this impact our ability to work together. When we discontinue treatment, how might this impact our relationship? In the event that a multiple relationship develops in an unforeseen manner, for example, you're seeing Sally in therapy, and then 2 weeks ago, she moved into your neighborhood, and now she's part of your HOA. Or she moved into your neighborhood, and her kids started going to school with your kids, and they became fast friends. Okay. Well, this is going to be a little tricky. We need to discuss the potential effects with the client. If our kids want to play together, that's fine. I'm not going to, break that up. However, I need to talk with Sally about how she feels about it and how we're going to negotiate this. And if she wants to start seeing a different therapist. Take reasonable steps to resolve the situation, including termination and the provision of referrals, and document the discussion in the client's record. Again, both of you sign it. It's too easy. I'm sorry. It's unethical, but I know of people who've done it. It's too easy to write down, yeah, we had this discussion, and sign it when you actually didn't. So both people need to sign it. Counselors will exercise caution and avoid exploitation or the appearance of exploitation before entering into a non-counseling relationship with a former client for at least 5 years. 5 years is our big number now. It used to be 2 years a long time ago. Some state boards still say 2 years, but the ethical code says 5 years. And you're going to hear that in several times over the next few weeks. Counselors will discuss with the former client important relevant considerations, including, if we're going to do something, all right, it's been at least 5 years, all right, we were in counseling relationship together for, was it 10 weeks or was it 2 years? That there's a different level of intimacy that may have developed, and maybe a different level of dependence that may have developed. The nature and circumstances of the client's counseling. If they were seeing you, for example, for marriage counseling, and now you think you're going to start dating them, I'm thinking that feels pretty icky. So you want to consider what you were seeing them for. Were they there? They were an involuntary client. The court said they had to come, and they did their time and they got out. That's somewhat different. But again, you still have to respect that 5-year boundary. The likelihood that the client will want to resume counseling. Once you start seeing them in a different kind of relationship, that's off the table. So if they want to see you again, then you can't. And possible negative effects or outcomes. It's important to brainstorm what these outcomes might be and continue to assess with the client or former client and yourself, if there are things going wrong in the relationship, is it because you had the counseling relationship and because there is an unequal power dynamic. In counseling relationships, we strive to make it equal, but it's not. And the counselor often has more power in the relationship in some ways. And that can translate into other types of relationships 5-10 years later. Counselors will respect the autonomy of each former client and not use undue influence to form any sort of relationship with a former client. Business development. Maybe you had this client, they did wonderfully in treatment, and you're like, hey, why don't you go out and promote my practice and bring me new clients because you were just wonderful. That's not okay. And obviously, you don't want to use undue influence to form any sort of personal relationship. When we're working with clients, we need to consistently reflect on our personal values and make sure that we're maintaining that boundary between what we value and believe and what the client values and believes. We can meet, we can agree, we can disagree, but we're going to respect that boundary. And as I mentioned, it's important that we reflect on whether we are indirectly imposing our personal values through our decor, through our approach to treatment, through our assessment, through our documentation, whatever it is. We do need to be consistent. One of the ways that we can also protect against violating this is consistently talking with clients about whether they feel respected. If they feel like their values and thoughts are being respected, great. And if not, then we need to say, tell me about what makes you feel uncomfortable or in what ways you feel your values haven't been respected. Sometimes there's going to be unavoidable harm. One of the most common is relationship changes when one person goes through treatment and their family hasn't. That may end up causing distress in those relationships until the family members all come together and make changes, or until those relationships are ended. We do need to respect confidentiality. I will be doing another presentation on CFR 42 Part 2 because they just made a bunch of changes to it. So I will be doing another just wildly exciting presentation on that in the upcoming weeks. Bartering is now accepted under certain conditions, but we do need to be very explicit in our contract, in the bartering contract, and it needs to be signed by both parties and reevaluated periodically to make sure that the client feels like they're being treated fairly, and obviously the clinician feels like they're being treated fairly. And we need to be very aware of multiple relationships. And too often we mistake multiple relationships because we think all we're talking about is romantic relationships or maybe online relationships. But no, it's not that. It's also seeing a coworker, seeing a neighbor, seeing a neighbor's husband, or, well, I guess he'd be your neighbor too, but you get my point. A lot of times we don't consider the non-romantic relationships and how they may constitute a ethical breach. In part 3, we're going to discuss something called boundary extensions, avoiding harassment, preventing abandonment, and a whole bunch more. Thank you for being with me today. I know this was it was ethics. So it wasn't one of those wildly exciting things that you're going to rush back to your office and go, hey, I feel energized. But it is a good reminder for us of what we need to do. And we need to make sure, again, our agencies are doing. Our agency policies, practices, environment constitute or communicate ethical behavior and create an environment that feels safe and empowering to all of our clients. and all of the people served. One of the ways, and while I'm waiting, if you have any questions, another one of the ways you can do this is by getting a focus group together of the people served, or survey them when they come in if you don't want to do a focus group, to find out what they might like to see, hear, whatever, in your organization. What changes might they like to see in order to feel safer and more empowered?